Hello everyone and welcome to today's talk at Google. Today's talk is a celebration. It is a celebration of a remarkable woman, a celebration of creativity and innovation. My name is Suhail and my guest today is one of the most acclaimed artists of our time, one who pioneered abstract painting, who transcended her generation and pushed the art form into new heights. It is my pleasure to introduce Samia Halaby. Samia was born in Jerusalem and spent early years of her life in the region, first in Jerusalem before moving to Beirut. After that, she moved to the US, where she currently resides. Samia is a passionate activist who is involved in the art and cultural scenes in New York. Her works are exhibited in some of the most prominent museums around the world, from the Guggenheim, both in New York and in Abu Dhabi, to the Chicago Art Institute, to l'Institut du Monde Arabe in Paris. The list goes on and on. Samia is also the first woman to hold the position of associate professor at Yale School of Art, where she taught for 10 years. How is that for an incredible achievement? For the coming hour, I would like to invite you to join us on a journey full of inspiration, a journey full of color, but also hardship, a success story against all odds. I would like to invite you also to be part of the discussion by interacting with us via the chat. In the coming hour, we will all get to hear from Samia and get to explore her work via her own words. So we would love to hear from you throughout. So please type in your reactions. I would love to hear what these works evoke to you and make you feel, as well as your questions and comments. Samia, good morning.
Good morning. Thank you.
Good morning.
Good evening. People are everywhere in the world.
Good morning or good evening, whatever you are, and welcome to our chat. Samia, I could have talked for the whole hour, but I don't think that's why we're here. So I think we're here to really hear from you. So maybe before we start, let me just ask you how you are doing.
I'm doing well. I'm feeling good. Thank you.
Great. So Samia, thank you so much for joining us. I would love to start our discussion with the journey itself, with the start of the journey itself. So you grew up as I mentioned, in Jerusalem before moving to Beirut. All of this before moving to the US. I would love to hear from you about your memories from the region and from the Middle East.
Thank you. I'm actually, when I think of where is my hometown, I think of Jerusalem. When I think where is my home generally, where am I from? I really think of Greater Syria. I feel just as identified with Lebanon, with Syria, and with Jordan. It takes me back to the political oppression we experienced from colonialism and imperialism. And I remember that our land was divided, Greater Syria was divided into 5 pieces by the Sykes-Picot Agreement. And to me, there are things in my reading and studies which shows how unified and how tied together the region is. So to me, that is all my home. But there are peaceful times one remembers home life and Arab family ties, which are so wonderful and close. I remember my childhood in Palestine as, my mother trying to cultivate us, me hating the piano lessons, the antics of my brothers, older brothers, trying to keep up with them. And as they would sneak into the living room to giggle over at naughty pictures in the National Geographic, I would wander in the living room looking at the paintings and being fascinated that my father had brought from his various journeys. So there was a lot of richness involved. My first memory of Lebanon is actually my first memory outside Jerusalem. I grew up some years in Jaffa on the port city of Palestine. And I experienced the Nakba and have extensive memories of that. During my 11th year in the spring, we took refuge in the mountains of Lebanon, and from there quickly moved to Beirut. And Beirut was just a beautiful city to spend my young teenage years in. I will always love and honor Beirut for that reason. And so the influences on me are from the region are deep and multifold, but aesthetically, I am so taken by the beauty of Arab art. In my eyes, it is outstanding and very influential on my work. I traveled the Arab area, those areas I call home, and other areas, and I've visited the Dome of the Rock and was influenced by the panels on the dome. I'd like to, and this is one of the panels that is monumental in size. I am guessing it is somewhere between 10 and 15 feet, which is not what you imagine to be typical of Arab inlaid marble panels, but they surround the outside of the dome and the geometry involved in them. And I haven't read enough about the geometry. I know the golden section, which is originally an Arab mathematician's practice and invention. So it influenced my paintings, and convergence between the geometry and the symmetry within the panel and the outline of the panel as a picture, to me, first of all, is as valuable as any painting we are educated to respect, and any painting in the West that might sell for millions. And it influenced my work compositionally and mathematically. So the paintings that are in my Dome of the Rock series, and the next two paintings we'll look at, is very intimate. It may not seem that way to people at first because I did not copy or imitate the way it looked. There is an attention. You will notice points hit the important points in the composition converge with the perimeter of the picture. That's very Arabic in its nature. Also, I had been shading all the time, and now I stopped shading and started being inspired by the inlaid materials of Arabic art by using textures to differentiate areas. And so this has been a very important inspiration, Suhail.
I think, Samia, there's a lot of probably a lot of people joining from the region, so I am sure they're happily hearing about the inspiration actually from the region. I'm really fascinated by the picture we just showed before, the detail and how much this detail triggers works such as these, and how rich these work are. And if we compare them to the picture before, such a small detail that maybe a lot of us have seen in real life, but maybe did not notice by itself, as opposed to the overall kind of work, and seeing what this translates to, I find really that extremely powerful. How would you describe this kind of within abstract art, and how easy do you think for people it is to approach such work?
In terms of abstract art, what is not accepted generally, and what we as Arabs don't write about, because material life, the ease of life in the Arab world has become so difficult, that to practice the kind of high degree of respect for learning and intellectuality that so inspired me in my youth as I read about it in Arab history, we don't seem to have the energy and the time for it at this point in our history. But what I see there is extremely valuable. And when we looked at that panel, it is important to also understand that it is a visual environmental art intimately connected to architecture. And when you do analyze it deeply, you begin to see that its formal attributes are fascinating, are really important. For example, I say environmental because it is a choir of other panels together. And not only a choir of panels, there is the floor and the ceiling as well. And when you leave and you find a space, a kind of social space in front of the architecture. And it has patterns like the mosque in Aleppo. The floor is full of different, call them paintings, like a whole set of superb Mondrians covering the floor. And from there you leave, and the streets, there is in Jerusalem a relationship between these panels and the environment. So it becomes a total city environment. The mosque or the church becomes the heart of a city or the focus. And the Dome of the Rock is exactly that kind of focus for the city. It is so overwhelming aesthetically. Though it is not respected and described generally, it is so overwhelming that any picture by anybody that wants to show Jerusalem shows the dome.
Absolutely.
So, yeah.
I love that we're touching on this notion of respect, and I want to kind of fast forward a little bit. Again, within your journey, maybe once you were in the U.S., the first time we met over VC, and we were talking. You spoke to me about your experience at Yale, and as I mentioned in the introduction, you taught at Yale School of Art for 10 years, and you were the first woman to hold the position of associate professor. And I'm sure that such an incredible achievement does not come very easy. You spoke to me about racism and sexism, for example. I would really love to hear more about this experience, and maybe how you approach these challenges throughout your career.
Well, I will try to cover it with a couple of specifics that shows experience, and maybe then make a general statement that might be helpful. And I'm going back in time. First, I want to talk about a piece I made in Hawaii called For Ni'ihau from Palestine. And what I did here was, I arrived in Hawaii, by the way, invited as a guest professor, and it was such a beautiful place. And I had taught there before, but now my third visit, I was feeling more adult and more mature and free, and traveled to other islands and enjoyed the natural growth there. The plant life is so impressive, but the sunshine and the warmth and so on. So I was feeling very expansive. And also I had left Yale by then, and I was feeling also expansive because I was free of academia and developing an independent intellectuality. So I created this piece, which has to do with how we think about nature and reality and how it enters our artwork. So I wanted to criticize those who create work based on making symbols of verbal ideas. So we think of an apple tree, we see in our mind an apple tree with ripe apples, but the tree grew through the seasons and kept changing from one condition to another. And throughout its life, it went through these daily changes, monthly, annual changes, and it grew and then ended its life. And so I thought, okay, a painting should do that as well. So in the faculty exhibition, I was given a huge wall, and I told them I'm going to make a mural on it. So I threw all kinds of canvases on it, and I started painting, but I didn't finish it. I waited till the opening and announced that it's going to grow with the show. So every 2 days I would go in there and add a few more marks. And so, but because it was dedicated to Hawaii, to Ni'ihau, and because I saw a similarity between how the Hawaiians are treated and how the Palestinians are treated, I made the painting a dedication to the Hawaiians living on the island of Ni'ihau, which was practically in a state of slavery. And so one day, I am told that I'm invited to dinner on the same night as there is an announcement that there is going to be a walk through the exhibition with discussion. So the two faculty take me out, and I'm saying, let's hurry and get back to the event. And no, they're delaying and delaying and delaying. And finally, they managed to pay and their slow molasses get me to the discussion. And what I found was a trap already for me. You know, they were all collected. There was one seat right in the middle left empty, and they completely hustled me to it. And they began a discussion. And what they found, you know, how could I dedicate this to the Hawaiians as a Palestinian when there was so much freedom fighters out there being heard about in the news and called terrorists? And how can I do that and use Western style painting to do that to them? You know, to me, that was, you know, in Hawaii, you can't get too angry. People are very laid back and sweet. But I could tell what was going on. And what was interesting, behind my chair when I came to sit on it, there was a worker who had been auditing art courses there, and he knew what was going to happen. And he stood behind my chair. He's ready to defend. I will always remember him. You know, I didn't know him and I don't know his name, but that was a beautiful experience. And anyway, to me, what is so ignorant on their part, and I say that with loving respect, is that they don't realize that this art was invented, this abstraction was invented during the revolution of the Soviet Union, the great revolution of a little over 100 years ago. And they claim it as Western in the same way they make out Leonardo to be ancient Greek art to be Western, or Leonardo to be American practically. So that was my first experience. When you mentioned Yale, it was a little more painful.
I made a lot of parallel, I think, to what a lot of women probably feel today, or a lot of people actually feel today, in their own field of work. And I found it, you know, when you look at art, maybe from the outside, you always feel it looks, it has a lot of glitter and it looks really nice. And I think it's a reminder that you know, this kind of behavior and inequality is actually everywhere in our society. So it's interesting to see the impact that this experience had on your art after your Yale experience as well.
The Yale experience, by the way, started with me being invited there by a professor that I knew at Indiana University. And I went, and a few days after my arrival, the dean of the school, or a few months, I don't remember exactly, was talking to me and telling me how wonderful I was for them, because I was like killing two birds with one stone. You know, here I am, a bird and a stone suddenly. So sorry to see the humor in all this. But, you know, I didn't laugh at the time. I was very perturbed. I thought, okay, you pick someone highly qualified, and then you told them you hired them because they're a woman and a minority in their view. You know, they have their categories for us. And then 10 years later, at that time, there was something called, excuse me, I can't remember what the law was called. But the government had legislated that universities and organizations and schools have to make room for women and for minorities and for African Americans. And so that's how I was useful to them. And then 10 years later, they had this, and Yale did not have women for a long time. That was their claim to fame, we're only men. So when 10 years later, I was nearly at tenure, they decided they no longer wanted any woman in the school on full time. So, and then at that point, we went through the grievance system, and I did a show called On Trial, Yale School of Art, and I fought back very, very strongly. And then eventually I won my grievance and received a letter which said you can come back to Yale provided you prove you're the world's expert on what you teach.
I love this notion of fighting as well.
Yeah, we fought very, very strongly. I had help. I had supporters from friends. But, the next painting I want to show is me continuing with my life. I mean, these things happen. I'm no longer under the thumb of the administration of Yale. The students were so helpful and very supportive, and they all wrote wonderful letters for me, but the administration decided those letters were secret, so I couldn't see them. But this piece is called Daughter in Her Mother's Garden. I did a whole series on the women of Palestine, inspired by my many return trips to Palestine beginning in the 90s, and inspired by the shapes of women wearing long dresses and in motion. So this piece is one of those. And I also inspired by to assert who I am in some ways as a painter. And so the next one is, I believe, the Dome of the Rock painting, which shows me in my studio in front of a large mural painting that was commissioned by a collector. And so to me, that was asserting, and it made the cover of two magazines in the Arab world. So it was lovely to find my work and my thoughts reflected in that way. The work itself is aesthetically depends very much on the ideas I learned from Arabic art, the convergence, the geometry, the golden section ideas, how it is made. It is two squares next to each other, which brings back the squares in the first panels I showed. And there is shading in it that comes from my knowledge of chiaroscuro in Italian art. And of course, there's the understanding of the importance of facture, which comes to me not only from Arabic art and the marble inlays and the mother of pearl inlays we are so familiar with when we play sheish beish, but also from Japanese and Chinese art. So these are all in that painting, as well as another symbolic fact besides symbolizing the Dome of the Rock. This to me symbolizes the beauty of the desert, the blue sky, and the yellow sand. So all of those things just converge in that painting. And it's, to me, a strong statement which many people hated and many people loved. So here it is, here I am.
I am a big fan. I think just to looking at all the comments that are coming in, I think a lot of words as to how inspirational that is, and some questions that I'm going to come back to in a few minutes. Samia, if you don't mind,
Suhail,
yes,
I was going to give a general idea. Can I read a little sentence about tokenism that might be helpful?
Yes, please.
I think tokenism is a double-sided sword. They kill us, they swish at us by telling us we hired you because you're women, not because you're highly qualified professional. Then they switch in the other direction and they hit on us by putting us in a box and saying you're female or you're Arab or you're this or that. And you're in that box, which is all of inferior people, but we found the best one among them. They apply this to African Americans all the time. We found one African American who's really qualified. Meanwhile, they're picking the best, most brilliant people around. So it's important for people to remember that their logic is defective, born out of greed and oppression, and that we must proceed with confidence. And so this is how I, think about it.
There's this kind of, I feel like always this notion of conflict, maybe, and there's a very interesting question that just came in. Maybe I'll read it out loud. So for an artist who lived through Nakba and experienced sexism, racism, The pieces are very colorful, and one wouldn't automatically link them to struggle. Do you think of colors before shapes?
They go together. You know, one of the things I will talk about is the idea of understanding growth, which I talked about it in the tree. So I think of shape as having, as I grow in my artwork and learn more. I can't say that's true of all my artwork, but now I think of how a shape grew. And how it grew is how it's made. The parts, in its growing, the parts decide what this edge would be. If it's a man-made object made of steel, it may have a sharp edge. If it's a tree as a whole, it has the facture of the leaves will outline the edge. And so they all go together, they all come together. And then there is a lot of intuitiveness in making paintings. The person who asked the question, you and everyone else have a storehouse of ideas of images in your brain. And so the brain puts them together as you think and you grow and you observe, etc. They get cooked. And then somehow, against your will, or with your trying to bring them out, they come out intuitively. You don't know why, but if you search afterwards, you learn why.
Thank you, Samia, and thank you, Sami, for asking the question. I want to also continue. So going back to this to the discussion that we're having now, you know, on these challenges that you faced, and you started kind of touching also on the art world and you know, how people perceive things in general. So when you moved to New York, you've probably also had these kind of similar challenges. My question is, how would you describe the art world back then when you moved to New York, and do you believe it has evolved much since then?
New York, when I first moved to it, I was expecting to find a more intellectual environment. I was expecting to be able to meet artists and talk with artists and exchange ideas. What I found was artists were competing with each other for the favor of the galleries. I did not find the intellectual atmosphere that I yearned for. But the exhibitions were still of abstract painting at that time. Eventually, as time went by, a kind of fantasy artwork began to come in, a kind of reaction to the abstraction that was taking place. And instead of visual painting, we began to see paintings that interpreted verbal ideas symbolically. And we began to see mixed media, and we began to see philosophies called postmodernism, which with ideas about deconstructing. And you remember the Soviet artists were called constructivists. So now we have critics of that politically saying deconstruction, you know, and many people picking it up and interpreting it not exactly in the way it was intended by propaganda, but interpreting it as, oh, let's take things apart and study them, which is fine. I found total rejection in New York. To be perfectly honest, it's a Zionist art world, and I'm a Palestinian, and the most they will do is be silent or keep me outside the focus. I'm not in focus here, and I think I never will be until they feel they can make money off me, to be blunt.
Sorry, I want to touch on this point specifically. We've heard about kind of this. I mean, you've mentioned respect a little bit, few times already throughout this discussion. And while preparing, I was watching one of your interviews, and I would like to read to the audience one sentence that truly, struck me, that I found very, very beautiful. And you said, to become truly intellectual, to think for yourself, to look at history, you have to see the world for what it is. You have to look at all art history, not only Western art history. You have to see it all with respect. First of all, it's a really beautiful sentence. How far do you think, based on our discussion now, society has come today when it comes to equality and equity?
Well, my answer is not going to be very optimistic. I don't think we've come very far. I think there have been gains in the upper middle class, but if I think of the world, of all of the world, I see a lot of suffering, and this COVID has even brought more suffering, but maybe it becomes the cause for us to try and do something about how things are. For me, my reaction to what's going on around me, especially in New York, was to become an activist for both Palestine politically and began paying attention to women's activism here. I remember there were very, very active women here in groups, making groups. I remember Marcia Tucker, who created the new museum, and they were. I was invited to a few of them. I attended where they spun the bottle and talk about, and it pointed to someone who it was then their turn to talk about what they experienced vis-a-vis a particular question. But the learning is so important. The being international in your understanding is so important. Art education in America is very Eurocentric and US-centric. People have to expand out of that, if necessary, on their own. For me, travel was a healing thing in that area. I first visited the Smithsonian, and I visit museums everywhere I am, less now. And so the art of China and Asia and in general and Japan, and for a few years there was nothing acceptable in my eyes except the art of China and Japan. They really deeply influenced me. I've also been to Cuba, and I attended, I was invited to be one of the central exhibitors at the Third Havana Biennial, which is a historic biennial. The year after, I attended but was not invited to the Venice Biennial. Of course, you have to be of a country that's acceptable to the Western world, and Palestine wasn't a country. So my hope of ever being in the Venice Biennial can just go down the drain. But beside the Havana Biennial, I visited the Basel Art Fair. And between those three, you saw a huge picture of the world. Were it not for my visit to Cuba, there is half the world that I would have been veiled from my eyes living here in New York. Visiting the Havana Biennial, seeing and being an exhibitor at the recent biennial in China was another great experience. These two showed me another half of the world. It's the first time in my life I saw art from Africa. I saw the weavings of South America. I saw paintings from China and India. It was an amazing experience. And so this, I advise people to become very international in their view of the world, in their study of art, of whatever their profession is. Scientists are better at this than artists are so propagandized. Scientists will know an advancement in mathematics or chemistry or physics made in India. Actually, here in America, they've kind of imported all the intelligent people, and the corporations are stuffed with them, and huge amounts of creativity comes from people who are not from here. Anyway, so
I want to actually I want to use a question from Yusuke from Tokyo, who's asking you, do you think art has a role in bridging political divides? Can you share any experience in which it had a positive role?
The thing is, what art can do and what is done with art are two different things. I wanted to mention I want to mention that there is a huge divide between the making of art and artists and the world of making art and those who exhibit it. Almost everybody wants to show it by the origin of the artist, so, and not by the artwork. It's as though they really don't know what they're looking at. I hate to insult everyone whose support I need, but it's as though critics and curators and museums and academia and all of them have no idea. Nobody has any idea what the art of the future will be. And so abstraction is particularly difficult for them to talk about. And so they exhibit us based on, this is an exhibition of Latino art. And often they're remedial, which is just as insulting. It's like being a token. And the art of African Americans. This is the art from the Arab world. This is this and that. It is remedial really more for the brains of people who have been brainwashed and do not know anything about the rest of the world. If we all had a good education, we wouldn't need all of these remedial shows. We'd know about them. But art itself, I was once invited to a conference where they expected me to say art can change things politically. And I had to say, no, it doesn't. I mean, I made my speech, my keynote speech, and they hated me afterwards, but that was in Vancouver Island. But, what changes the world is collective political action, not art. But there are artists, and artists can express what they feel about the world. And that's a question that comes to me. A young man once asked me, where's Palestine in your artwork? And I had to really think hard about it. Who is asking? You have to think, there's a young man who is an activist. I want to answer him honestly. But then there are those who want to put me in a box, who want me to go back to my quote unquote roots. Well, my roots are the entire globe. Sorry, they're not limited. I know where my home is, but I know where my mind can wander. So yes, it's an important question, and it has many sides.
I think can be applied, to so many facets of our life, I would say. There's another question that I read also on the chat, and I would love to, I would ask you this before we introduce a short clip before moving on to the next part of our discussion. People are asking only for advice from you. So what advice do you have, or what advice would you give to women, maybe men as well, that are watching us now?
Well, my advice to women and men and young and old is to absorb into your entire being, and especially your thinking, that everything is in motion and changing. And that is the open sesame of creativity. If you are just seeing things frozen empirically, you're really analyzing dead things. But if you want to really succeed, you want to analyze and study living things, and living things are changing. So that may be like too philosophical or too distant, but see it as a general and try to search for its particulars. And yes, you're right, we should try and talk about our next. Maybe I will start it by saying I have done a piece, especially a piece in honor of women, which might be for this month appropriate to show. And I titled it Brass Women, inspired by my activism and admiration of African American and Latino women and their incredible clear voices and their oratory.
So I think this is a perfect segue to our next to this next section, where actually you were one of the pioneers to work with computers actually in the 80s, and as we've just seen in this example, and we're going to see many more. Can you tell me a little bit more about this journey, and how did you decide to bring in technology and art together?
Actually, let me start by saying I think art and technology belong in everything. Every discipline, even when I have to sweep the floor, the practice of doing it helps me invent things. And so I invent a better way to sweep the floor, and that's creative. I think of mathematicians who have to know all about mathematics, and then they get into that area where they've absorbed everything known, and they are wondering out in outer space, you might say, of the mind, what is the next step? And then that's where it becomes beautiful. There becomes beauty and creativity in science at that point. And at that point, it's just like painting or just like sweeping the floor. You have to test it and it has to work. What's the point of fantastic new physics and chemistry and science and etc. if it's not useful to us? And so the same is true in painting, and also in my knowledge of the history of art. The most important artwork that we respect most deeply is done with the technology of its time. It has no backwardness about it. It's expressly about its time, with the most advanced of its time. So I began to ask that question, and also I was thinking, poor Leonardo and Michelangelo, when they dissected a cadaver, think of how dangerous and difficult that was. If they could do that, for me to try the computer is nothing. And I had always wanted to. So finally, I was visiting my sister, and she had an Apple II, and I could play with it and use Logo to program. And the reason I hadn't gotten to computing earlier is because the machines were super expensive then, and you had to be part of an organization, a university, a corporation to even get near one of those monstrous, huge computers. So I came home, I bought an Amiga and started testing, and learned how to program, because I was asking, what is the nature of the material that is the computer? I didn't want software engineers or programmers to decide for me what my expression would be. So here's the first piece I made. It's a little sketch, and let's look at it, and then I'll describe it a bit. No, there was a sketch called Rhythm or Dance. But anyway, working on the Amiga, I was able to program little programs that were fairly primitive. I think programmers in Google watching now might really laugh at it, but I hope lovingly, where I was able to make abstractions that moved and had sound, and that to me was very much the computer. And then going to conferences, I would see musicians playing together impromptu, and I thought, oh, how great it would be to create an abstraction impromptu with them. So I converted the keyboard. I moved to the PC because the Amiga wouldn't let me do it, and started programming the keyboard. So my keyboard became a piano of abstract painting. So the keys, each key had 4 or 5 little programs connected with it, based on whether it's cap H or home H or down H or whatever. And they would play. And I had keys that would decide the colors, and I had keys that would create constant motion. And those I could sit and play and impromptu. So I started collaborating with musicians, and we would decide on a theme, and we would always, it would be always a new thing. It never was, we couldn't duplicate it. And that still image we saw that passed a minute ago was because I had designed in the I wanted to capture some of the images that were being created, so I designed in my program a screen capture function. At that time, there were no screen captures, so I was able to create those still images, and they can't be duplicated so easily. Recreated again in the program. I'm sure you can copy the zeros and ones easily, but yes, but the program itself running that you were interested in, I'll let you introduce and run.
Yes, I actually we can show an example of the video itself, and also maybe it's safe to say, Samia, you are the inventor of the screenshots, so everybody uses today.
I wasn't. I didn't invent anything. I'm very backward as a program.
Maybe we can see a short clip. I have another one as well to show after.
Okay. So Hale, actually, that was the Amiga.
Yes.
Where I wrote, where people would ask me, "Do you have a tin ear? Can you even hear music notes?"
I have a great example though with music. Maybe let's watch the next video with music, and then I would like to ask you a question about that.
Okay.
Well, I could have played minutes and minutes of this, but we for the time that we have, I think it's really a beautiful video, frankly. And I think, and also you've mentioned before, to be an artist of my time, I should explore the technology of my time. And you mentioned to me last time we spoke that the instruments used in the video are more mature and perfected than the computers themselves. I guess my question is, how satisfied are you with the technology we have today, and to what extent can it amplify your creative process?
Well, I eventually moved away from computing and programming, regretfully, but there were problems coming up with barriers created by corporations who wanted to have their own control over the area of computing. So it wasn't easy to travel a program from one computer to the other. It wasn't easy to create videos, and it wasn't easy to share. And also, there is something still about large-scale painting and the delicacy of color possible, and its presence. So I did return to painting, and the computer stayed with me as a love and an influence on painting, and that I learned a lot about my creative process by computing. And by the way, just as an aside, quickly, I fell in love with the nature of the computer and with the nature of programming. To me, a program was sort of like a city. It had its beauty and its organization and its flow. And also, even a computer to me, and when I used to think about the basics of it, I used to think, well, I could make a computer on a mountainside in the mud and just drop a ball with decisions, yes, no algorithm. And then I decided, oh, a river is an algorithm. You know, it goes from up there to down here, and it has to find its way. And there are millions of rivers, and they find their way, and they are different in their shapes. So, and when I first went to the computer, I was ignorant, and so I was a little disappointed. I expected more from it. I expected it to respond to some things I did, which was really foolish on my part. I've learned since then there's no such thing as artificial intelligence, although people will want to argue with me about that, but that's okay. I don't know. I think the computer is now, I think about it now, it is very, very hard to know its nature and try and make art with its nature, but it helps us with everything. It is so versatile. It can release creativity in anybody, and creativity will start more in the mind and understanding the world and analyzing the computer and analyzing what you want to work with, and also trusting your intuitions. So the versatility here is something harder to cope with and harder to pinpoint as to, is it wood? Wood makes us do certain tools to carve it with. It has a nature, it has a grain. What is it about algorithms, the yes-no decision making, the zeros and ones, getting right down to the heart of it? What is there a nature to those that makes artwork really exploit that attitude? But then you can exploit higher levels of programming. You can exploit Photoshop and do photo montage, and that could release creativity. So it's not an easy answer, Suhail.
So maybe in a few hundred years, it will be as embedded to art and music as instrument, and what you see as instruments today are to music. Let's see. Samia, I'm aware also of the time, and we can't just ignore the situation around us today and not talk about kind of the situation that the world has been in for the past year. And I feel that we're at a time where introspection is more present than ever in people's lives. What impact do you think the pandemic had on people's relationship with art? And maybe how did that influence your creative process?
It's been a very difficult time for a lot of people, and very, very painful for those who lost their jobs and can't pay their rent or have become homeless or don't have food to eat. And that is worldwide now, and very painful. I would dream of something that would give us free healthcare in the future. But for me, first being imprisoned in the house was not a problem. You always yearn for some free time and isolation to paint. And I got a lot of requests to be on Zoom and webinar events, so that took up my time. But in terms of painting and the art world, it closed down a great deal. The market in certain areas shut down a lot. Artists continued to produce, I think. For me, I took it as a quiet moment and started using methods that I had been hoping to use before, free myself and just scribble, paint very freely. And this painting that I am showing you here is based on that. And I titled it, Here Is Where I Am Now, because I was sharing it on social media with people and asking them to comment. And many, along the journey of the various appearances of this painting, many people yelled, "Stop, stop." But then finally I stopped at this stage, and that's why I called it Here Is Where I Am Now. But it's the first time I use very loose, very freehand scribbling. But in the end, that kind of method of creating the painting is not different from others. I'm still The intuitive painter is still building, deciding areas, deciding color, deciding what works here and what works there, what's too much, what's big, what's small, etc.
It is a lot of responsibility, though, to say stop here, right? To be able to say stop the creative process. I think it's something very hard. I mean, I don't know for people, at least for me, I wouldn't be able to tell you where to stop, I guess. So, but I like the name a lot. Here's where I am now. Samia, I would like to close on one final question. After this pandemic, if you wish, or if you could wish for one major change to happen after the pandemic, what would that change be?
Oh, don't limit me to one wish. Let me give you a few. I want free healthcare for everyone all over the globe, and a guaranteed home and a guaranteed job, and that we will be able to build a society free of the violence of capitalism and its greed. That's what I wish for. It may have
I hope then all of these wishes will come true. Samia, thank you so much for this very frank and lovely discussion. I want to say that a lot of we had a lot of people commenting on how inspirational this talk has been. Especially when we were discussing your own experiences. There's a lot of questions that unfortunately because of time we couldn't answer, but I really want to say thank you so much for being with us, and have a great day.
Thank you, Suhail. I loved being with you. I love the sense of humor you're injecting into it. I responded to it. So to everybody, thank you for watching. Be well. Take care of yourself. Bye.